刚把画面转过去，他就看到他被老虎打死。
Of course, a sound plan for honor. A sound plan.
看他没杀掉呢。
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. You are past redemption. Foul. Betrayer of the light. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For my father. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Justice. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
让我去开个改建。
I'm here to help. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. For my father, the king. Betrayer of sight. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
直接飞过来。
A sound plan.
那我们撞球撞一下。
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of
中
course.
洞路网。
For
哎，有
honor.
没有人说到撞球？有没有人在看那个的？抖音那个有个叫子涵大帝。
You are past redemption. A sound plan. For honor.
看，怎么又空心啊？靠腰嘞！
Certainly.
把推过去，
A sound
砸过去的
plan. Of course.
哭啊！
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
气运之子，没错。
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. The light is my
我
strength.
今天推整的怪怪的，
A
都
sound
推不到那个，都
Certainly.
推不到那个冰里面的。
Of course. For my father, the king. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done.
会出八阵吗？为什么要出八阵
The？ light is my strength. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. The light is my strength. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Certainly. A sound plan.
我太死了，
Our allies' hero has fallen.
我们可以说他太死了。
Our
哪里有太
allies'
死？
town is under siege.
我还什么世界？没有太死了。
A sound plan. Betrayal of light. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For my father and king. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Our hero has
注意刀， 补一发。后面有人，
Our allies' town is under siege.
我
Allies' hero has fallen.
两个差一点。
I'm here to help. For honor. The light is my strength. A sound
Our forces are under attack.
for honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound for honor. A sound plan.
Our
For
allies'
honor.
town is under
Certainly.
siege.
A sound plan. Certainly. For
Our
honor.
forces are under
Certainly.
attack.
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Betrayer of light.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege. Our allies' hero has
For
fallen.
honor. For my father. For Lord Orion. Of course.
Betrayer of light.
A sound plan.
Our allies' hero has Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
先买一下。
Justice
Our
shall be
allies' town is under siege.
done. The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under
Certainly.
siege.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
切入。
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Feel my wrath.
哎，没招，没事。
A sound plan. Certainly.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For honor.
咚咚。
Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For
Allies hero
Of
has
course.
fallen.
A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
啊，要
A
16了。
sound plan. For honor.
Our allies'
Certainly.
town is under
For
siege.
A
Our
sound
forces are under attack.
For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Your allies' hero has fallen.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound
Allies'
plan.
hero has fallen.
For honor. A sound plan.
我去上路接兵，
For honor. Certainly. Of course.
上路点到手去接一下。
Our allies' town is under
A
siege.
sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. For honor. Light. I stand for my father's kingdom. Certainly. For honor.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
是的，搭档。
I'm here to help.
Our allies' hero
Of
has
course.
fallen.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
先买一下。
A sound
Our
plan.
allies' town is
For
under
honor.
siege.
Of course. I
这
stand
司
for
马
the
师应该
light.
是没什么救的。
Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Our allies' town is under
For honor.
siege.
感
Certainly.
觉文枪邪斧要一起出，
A sound plan.
这有可能还要一个霸
Is there danger? Certainly.
先赚
Of course.
赚神装先
For。honor. Certainly. For honor.
Our allies'
A
town
sound
is under
plan.
siege.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our allies' town is under siege. Allies' hero has fallen.
For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our forces are under attack. Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
哎，小兵把我狼吃掉。
A sound. A sound.
太过分了。
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound. Of course. For honor. A sound. Of course. course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
这波挺赚的，泡到退刀，
Justice.
然后又清了兵，又刷了人，
For honor.
赚。
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. For Lord Orion.
Allied hero has fallen.
A sound plan. Of course.
Justice is home.
A
哎
sound
哎，
plan.
两个320都没吃到，
For honor.
哭了。
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
进化，
I'm here to help. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
不行，
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Allied hero
Of
has
course.
fallen.
Certainly. Of course.
可以
Certainly.
是泡出来。
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
这边不知道有没有演，
For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
没推好，
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Shit.
For my father, the king. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
拉得
Of
好，
course. A sound
连
plan.
旗剑吧，
Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For
Our
honor.
allies' town is under
Certainly.
siege.
For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly.
等下再布个眼，
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Justice is
sound plan. Certainly, for honor. I stand for the law.
抓到了。
Of course. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. For my father. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
这样我是不是要四处去猜啊？
Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
他直接死掉了，靠腰。来出灯哦。
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger?
Our allies'
Of
town
course.
is under siege.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Foul. For honor. Of course.
嘿，
A sound plan.
我想要不要出血符？
Betrayer of the light. Our allies' town
感觉
is
是得
under
出。
siege.
Of course. For honor. You are past redemption. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Justice shall be done.
Our
哎，刘备，
allies' town is
A
under
sound
siege.
你
plan.
们踢笑哦，
Certainly. For honor.
看真假的？
Certainly. A sound plan.
Allies' hero has fallen.
For honor. A sound
帮
plan.
我刘备，
For honor.
用命去留人呢，
A sound
也是一
plan.
代枭雄了。
For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
我
Certainly.
们先撑硬吧。
For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
The forces are under attack.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
有刘备在拉的话，我们撑硬应该是比较好。
I stand for the light.
感觉来个
Of course. For honor.
那
Sound
个黑月加
for honor. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For Lord. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
拍顶。
A sound. Of course. For honor. A sound.
Our forces are under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
投个屁呀、经济差1000块，人头差3颗，你要投降，干太无耻了吧！
Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. Certainly.
Our allies' hero has
Certainly.
fallen.
Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Our allies' town is under
咦、
siege.
出事出事！
Our hero has fallen. Allies' hero
不是啊
has fallen.
那个张辽，
Allies' hero has fallen.
张辽是真的选张辽吗？还是看到赵云才选张辽的？
Our allies' town is under siege.
有志气一点啊。
Our allies' town is under siege.
I stand for the light. The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
我们可以从上面路过去吧。
For honor.
Our allies' town is under
A
siege.
sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
你们推中路，我先把上路推过去，结果把我拉出去。
A sound plan. The light is my strength. For honor.
You are past redemption.
Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Sound certainly. Sound
Allies' hero has fallen.
a sound plan. Of course, a sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Allies' hero has fallen. Allies' hero
Of course, a
has
sound
fallen.
plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Certainly.
有要我开大吗？
Of course. Certainly. Justice.
看到。
A sound plan. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. A sound plan.
那行动好痒。
Justice is come.
Of course.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Found.
Our allies'
A
hero
sound
has
plan.
fallen.
Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan.
我想开大绝的。
Past redemption.
Certainly. Of course.
Justice is come.
For honor. Certainly. A sound
来下边。
plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For my father. Certainly. Of course.
哎，要买什么？
A sound plan. For honor.
Our allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' town is under siege.
Shall be done. Of course. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength.
Our
霸
allies'
王吧
town，is under siege.
这个700块可以换什么？现在没什么东西可以换。
Of course.
这个可以吗？
Our allies' town is under siege.
倚天我没有格子啊，我现在没有格子买倚
I stand for
天
the
的。
light.
Our
Yes,
allies'
yeah.
hero has fallen. Our allies' town is under siege.
猎狱吧，猎狱吧，
Is there
我现
danger?
在没有格子。
Certainly. Of course.
你要不要拉我呗？
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. For certainly.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound foul. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
秒杀！他挺硬的，没有秒杀。那其实有点逼
Our
真。
allies' town is under siege.
Sound plan. Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. For honor.
Our hero has fallen. Our allies' hero
没
has
大，
fallen.
大局差一点。觉得你打不动他呢？哇哇哇哇哇！
For honor. Of course. A sound. Of course. Certainly. For Lord Iran.
Forces are under attack.
A sound.
睡着。
Of course.
不过我们这装备狗干暖，没有防。
A sound.
怎样？你那边干嘛？
Certainly. A
你
sound.
那边什么意思？
For honor. The light is my strength.
要不要死？
Of course.
My light. Our allies' hero has fallen.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
哎，
I'm here to help. Certainly.
来吃一下吗？武刀白
The
虎，
light is my strength.
哎呦，你这什么装？
Is there danger?
Forces are under attack.
I'm here to help.
You are past.
绝影。
stand for
而且他蓝色鞋子都不卖还是怎样？他还死蛮多次不是吗？对啊，他19次，为什么蓝色鞋子不卖？
Of course, a sound plan. I'm here to
好像现在这个光这个球真的是好烦，
justice
烦死
shall
了！
be done. For honor.
什么时候要改版呢？这个球太靠腰了吧？
Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
抓起来好痒，但是用 A 2下就死。
Of course. For honor.
Betrayal of the light.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
2下就会死了，差一点点，可惜猪把爆了。